what we are doing, and a lot of this has to do with fundraising, is we're presenting about every week. A notice comes out about some other resident, usually it's someone well-known, to try and dispel the myth that public housing residents are not like us, right? And also to assist, obviously, in fundraising. So this is an interesting kind of thing. What are oral histories for, and when is it appropriate to use them? That's a big question.
Yeah.
That's a hard one.
So I'm Janet Smith. I'm an associate professor in urban planning here at UIC, and I co-direct a research center called the Nellie P. Borghi Center for Neighborhood and Community Improvement. I'm a Chicago native, and I came back to Chicago 15 years ago to work here at UIC, and I immediately was immersed in the public housing question. This was 1997, and it was right when just everything was in turmoil and weren't sure what was happening with the plan coming forward. And my first sort of foray, by the way, I do housing research primarily, so I'm not, I'm not a heavy quant person or data person, but I do a lot of work with data. And I think that what makes me maybe a little bit different on the panel is telling people stories through data, which often seems to dehumanize, but at the same time, it's telling the stories that they want to be told. And I think that's the thread that I looked when I was thinking about this through my work. So one of my first projects was before the plan for transformation was approved. The residents had said they were very concerned that if they were going to be mass movements of people out into the rental market, if you know what the mid-90s were like, the rental housing market in Chicago was extremely tight and very fast-moving and hard to get apartments, let alone try and be a black person from public housing to go out and find housing. So they asked a very important and very simple question, what's out there, what's happening in the rental housing market? And so I was charged with a huge project, very political, I would say, more so in breadth than in terms of the data collection, although it was a huge data collection project, to really understand the rental housing market. So there was a study called Regional Rental Market Analysis, and that was a mass grouping of researchers to answer what seems like a simple question, but what was hinging on the answer was really the plan for transformation. That sounds like, it's very serious, but there was a real fundamental question there, and it was, can the market really absorb residents moving out? And because the residents, they really were concerned of what was going to happen to them, and they knew that if they knew already, because our center, before I was there, the Maury Center, and Itai, who was mentioned, he and Pat Wright, who's the previous director, did a study with Cabrini residents asking this very same question: where are we going to end up? We studied it, looked at it, found that people were going to probably move to some of the worst neighborhoods, worse off than they were already, in probably poorer housing conditions or equally poor. And so, even with activism to help people find better housing was going to be very hard. And so we kind of knew what we were going to find, but we did this, systematic study for the residents. And I emphasize that because people forget that the residents requested it, and that HUD, actually, Department of Housing and Urban Development, listened to them. And so it turned into a larger kind of political arena, bread and circus, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, we concluded that residents most likely were going to be relocated to worse off conditions. We modeled it out. We sort of showed these things. And, the CHA still continued on. And the federal government allowed it to go forward. And it still makes me very angry, I guess is a better way to say it, best way to say it. But through that process, I came to kind of develop, I guess, sort of a level of respect from public housing advocates and public housing residents as sort of the data person. So when they have questions, they come to us a lot of times at our center. And so I was continued after that research. So I was a member of the Coalition to Protect Public Housing here in Chicago. And so that was really sort of my role. Was not so much whenever we needed data or information, we would, I was sort of the person because it was part of the coalition for that role, among other people. I think just a few other things though that sort of moving forward, that's sort of data and using data to tell people's stories or to tell the story they want to be told. So public housing residents, their story can be told with data, but it's also like what's happening around them that makes it so hard for them to be able to move out of housing, or that makes it so essential to keep public housing. I think that's the theme that is really important, and that's more work kind of moving forward, and some work that Eitan and I have been involved with the Central Advisory Council in the last 6 months. One other piece though that is sort of a foray where it's really kind of reflects my background as an art major and sort of an advocate rather than a researcher was I think we were trying to remember in 2005, there was the coalition was sitting around and we were talking with some artists who, we had this idea that we wanted to raise some questions about the CHA and the stories they were telling. So if anyone remembered, they had this whole big Leo Burnett $6 million advertising campaign, and they had bus shelters and they had testimonials on these bus shelters, these big pictures with a testimonial of a resident about how they had gotten out of public housing, and they're very, very well crafted. And then there were also testimonials like by some of the kind of people who were involved in this. But the group, we started talking about CHA was rebranding itself, and they were calling themselves Change. And so we started playing with the idea of, instead of CHA and GE, somebody took a Post-it note and just put across it and said OS, and it became Chaos. And so there was a whole chaos campaign, and I can say on the record now that I was involved in it, but for a while there was some FBI investigations going on or something like that. There was a lot of people who were...
Because you replaced some of the $6 million.
I did not personally do that. I did not have a key to the set, but
they replaced some of the posters that said Change with exact duplicates that said Chaos, and it took several days for the city to notice that.
There was one on the south side for a week for what I heard, and built things. But that material was grounded again. It was to tell an alternative story, and it was really meant, and it was fact checked and grounded, and so it was not disputed. Okay, they just didn't like the method of delivery. I guess is a better way to say it. So I point that out because I think there's a space for that kind of activism, and I really like that. So I kind of balance myself out with this kind of things.
That's guerrilla art. Do you realize
Yeah,
that?
I didn't put a mask on. So that's all I have for now.
So I'm Eitan Michaeli. I am the executive director and publisher of WeThePeopleMedia.org. My involvement in public housing, I guess, goes back to 1991 when I started as a reporter with the Chicago Defender newspaper, and I covered the shooting of a 8-year-old boy named Dantrell Davis in the Cabrini development. That was kind of the first. I covered little things in public housing before that, but that was like the big things that I kind of had a ground's eye view of from the beginning to its dating on, I guess. And in 1996, I started the Residence Journal, which was a print magazine written for and by public housing residents, and which was chartered by the resident leadership and paid for by the Chicago Housing Authority at a moment that the Housing Authority was run by some pretty, I don't know if you want to call them progressive or open-minded people who were dispatched personally by President Clinton, much against their will, to come and it's true, like they said no, and the president called and said you have to go and say no to the president. But, they were dispatched to run public housing in Chicago and kind of rehab its reputation, if not its actual function. And they, one of the things they wanted to do was start an independent newspaper in their midst. And they supported us as an independent newspaper against their own staff very often for the first 3 years. And then the leadership of the Housing Authority was changed by Mayor Daley, brought in his own people who did not have the same vision of fostering conversation with residents. They wanted to among other things, they wanted to shut down the Residence Journal. They kind of threatened us, and I didn't know whether we would just kind of go softly into the night or what was going to happen, but I had a long conversation on the lakefront with Jamie Calvin down at the end of the table there, who convinced me, I won't say tricked me, I'll just say convinced me that it was possible to start a nonprofit organization and to save the Residence Journal and kind of move it into like a nonprofit with a nonprofit home. So we fought the CHA. I threatened them and said I was going to go to the newspapers and say that they were squashing residents' First Amendment rights. If the tape recorder was, well, it's on, but I guess I can confess that at the time I really didn't know if if those papers were going to write about anything, but that threat worked, and the CHA backed off enough for a year to kind of give us the space to create a nonprofit organization with great advice from Jamie, and not just advice, but a lot of sweat equity from Jamie, who's a board member of We the People Media, and a lot of other people, including a lot of residents who've been part of I hope Ms. Thomas will talk about that a little bit too, that residents who have been a part of the We the People Media. We shifted over, became a nonprofit organization. We published the Residence Journal magazine until 2010 as a print publication, and it mostly exists online today. The archives exist online, not fully complete, but they will be soon, and most of it's online, and we still write articles that are published online, but mainly these days we do a lot of youth training, youth journalism training, through what we call the Urban Youth International Journalism Program, which is broader than just public housing residents, but it's focused generally on kind of low-income families. And Janet just mentioned we've been working together with a number of other really experienced people in public housing to produce a report with the Central Advisory Council. I don't know if you guys have seen it. If you haven't, you must. It is a really comprehensive, I didn't contribute to any of the kind of technical parts, so I can say with authority that I think it's really well conceived. It's really a reasonable and thoughtful vision for how public housing can be useful to help alleviate some of the housing crisis in the city. It's not just a vision for public housing. It's a holistic vision of what public housing can do in the city. And I really strongly encourage you to check it out and to support that document, because the resident leadership today is the best led, best organized, best equipped of any of the resident leadership iterations that I have seen in more than 20 years of kind of covering this issue. So there have been, resident leadership has historically been everything from, ward hack types to people who are just there for kind of personal gain. That is not the case now. Now you have folks that are very, dedicated and thoughtful and really working together. They kept us on point when it came to the report. They gave us no end of critique to help make the report really their vision of what public housing can do. So I'll just make that pitch that it's really a document that I think all of you would
I would add that what's great about it is the residents asked the question. So they were trying to respond to the CHA's recalibration process they're in now. So there were 5 areas, but what I really appreciated, we walked into the first meeting and there was the set of questions and concerns they had, and they're like, find us answers to this, help us find out what's going on and how we could be out in front. And so what's great is they have now a document. The CHA's plan is not out yet. So for them to be able to position themselves first, and that's what they're doing now. They're getting it out there. They've been rolling it out and getting people, the right buy-in. So I just second in terms of the strength of the leadership right now and just the savvy of them. And it's not just about Chicago public housing. It's about public housing in the United States and really the world. I mean, they have a very, very grounded position, but they have a global perspective as well.
And for the record, let everyone know how they can get a hold of this information.
So it's centraladvisorycouncil.tumblr.com, or you can just send me
Do you want to introduce yourself, Carolyn?
Sure.
I'm Carolyn Thomas, Director of God's Day. At one point I headed 3 programs that was within Robert Taylor Homes. Originally, we started at the church, and then we opened a food pantry with the help of the Chicago Area Project. And then we received funding through Heifer Project International as the first urban ag group in Chicago. So we opened 2 more sites. Our group combined with residents to fight against the plan for transportation, affectionately known as the fighting worms of
That's
the
it.
260s. So God's game still exists
Because of the worm farm.
because of the worm farm. Heifer Project's mandate for funds is that you raise livestock, and the livestock that was raised in Robert Taylor is worms and fish. So we still do urban ag. We also have a CETA office where we help people regain or establish utility services.